It began as a hushed exchange buried deep within the corridors of Kensington Palace. A conversation so tightly guarded that even senior aides were left outside the room. But the silence didn't last. When Catherine, Princess of Wales, emerged, her expression told a story the palace refused to confirm. Something had shifted. And at the center of it all was a name no one expected: Zara Tindall. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What followed that closed-door exchange did not unfold in public statements or polished briefings, but in silence measured, deliberate, and unusually heavy. Reports suggest that inside that room sat Prince William alongside a cluster of senior legal advisors. Figures rarely seen together unless something of lasting consequence is at stake. And yet, there were no announcements, no immediate clarifications, only a tightening of protocol and a wave of quiet instructions filtering through palace staff, urging restraint, urging secrecy, urging distance from a story that had not yet fully surfaced. It is now whispered in the highest echelons of royal circles that sealed document. TS tied to Queen Elizabeth II had unexpectedly resurfaced documents long believed to be dormant, protected not just by legal barriers, but by tradition itself. Different interpretations of this sudden reappearance describe a moment of internal reckoning, one that forced even the most composed figures within the institution to confront something they had not anticipated. Catherine's visible unease only deepened the mystery. Those familiar with her measured public demeanor noted the shift immediately. This was not routine concern, nor was it the quiet pressure of royal duty. This was something heavier, something personal, yet deeply institutional. And then came the second movement, subtle but impossible to ignore. Zara Tindall, a figure who had long remained respectfully outside the monarchy's central machinery, was quietly summoned. No formal announcement, no ceremonial framing, just a discreet request that carried more weight than any public declaration. Insiders whisper that her presence was not incidental, it was necessary. That whatever had been uncovered, whatever had been re-examined within those sealed pages, it had drawn her into a narrative she had never actively pursued, yet W could not avoid. Media insiders, sensing the shift but lacking confirmation, began to hint at what they cautiously described as a will-related revelation, a phrase that carried implications far beyond inheritance alone. Because within the royal family, a will is never just about assets, it is about intent, legacy, and the silent architecture of power that outlives even the sovereign. And as these whispers began to gather momentum, one truth started to emerge through the uncertainty. This was not a misunderstanding, not a procedural review, but the beginning of something far more consequential. Something that had been written long ago, waiting for the precise moment to reveal itself. But what began as a quiet legal clarification would soon unravel into something far more explosive, an inheritance decision that would shake the very structure of royal power. Long before the current storm, a document had already been written carefully, deliberately, and with a precision only Queen Elizabeth II was known for. But now, years later, that document was being re-examined under a very different light. What once existed quietly within the sealed confines of royal protocol had begun to stir. Out through official confirmation, but through whispers that carried an unusual weight. Reports suggest that this was no ordinary will, no routine transfer of personal belongings or ceremonial assets. Instead, it was something far more calculated and an instrument of long-term control, shaped with an awareness that stretched far beyond a single lifetime. Those familiar with the monarchy's internal traditions understand that royal wills are not simply private documents. They are often sealed for decades, protected from public scrutiny under legal mechanisms that preserve both privacy and institutional stability. But that very secrecy, while designed to protect, can also conceal intentions that only reveal themselves when circumstances shift. And now, something had shifted. Various interpretations of recent internal reviews describe a quiet but intense re-examination of the Queen's final directives, particularly those tied to inheritance structures that govern not just wealth, but influence. Because within the royal framework, inheritance is never just about possession, it is about positioning. about who stands where when the balance of power begins to tilt. Insiders whisper that specific clauses within the document were drafted with extraordinary care, outlining not only who would receive certain assets, but under what conditions, and perhaps more importantly, under whose oversight. Mentions of historically significant estates, such as Balmoral and Sandringham, began to surface within these discussions, not as symbols of luxury, but as anchors of legacy, each tied to centuries of continuity and expectation. These are not merely properties, they are institutions in their own right, carrying with them a weight that cannot be easily transferred without consequence. And yet, it is precisely within these layers of legal precision that something unexpected began to emerge. Early signs suggested that certain names that many assumed would naturally appear were absent. Not overlooked, not mistakenly omitted, but deliberately excluded. This realization did not arrive all at once. It unfolded gradually, through careful reading, through cross-reference clauses, through the kind of scrutiny that only occurs when something feels off. And as that feeling grew stronger, so did the speculation. Media insiders, constrained by the lack of official confirmation, began to frame it, cautiously describing the will not as a ceremonial closure, but as a strategic blueprint, one that may have been designed to guide the monarchy through a future the Queen herself would never witness. Why structure it this way? Why embed such calculated decisions within a document meant to remain hidden for so long? These questions lingered, unanswered yet impossible to ignore, as the narrative continued to unfold. Because if this was indeed a strategy, then it was one crafted with a clear understanding of the tensions that would follow. And as each layer of that carefully constructed document was examined, one truth became increasingly difficult to dismiss. This was not simply about inheritance, it was about control, about direction, about ensuring that the institution would move forward according to a vision set long before the present moment. And as the layers of that carefully crafted document began to peel back, one absence became impossible to ignore. It wasn't what the will included that stunned insiders, it was what it didn't. Because buried within its legal precision was a silence louder than any declaration: the absence of Queen Camilla. At first, the discovery did not arrive with shock, but with hesitation. Those reviewing the document reportedly paused, reread, cross-checked because what they were seeing did not align with expectation. Legal analysts, accustomed to the layered complexity of royal documentation, began quietly flagging what they described as a critical omission. Not a technical gap, not a clerical oversight, something far more deliberate. Reports suggest that within the structured language of the will, where every clause is measured, every name placed with intent, there was no provision, no acknowledgement, no trace of a figure many assumed would be central. And that absence, once recognized, could not be unseen. Palace insiders whisper that conversations quickly shifted in tone, moving from curiosity to concern. Because within the monarchy, inclusion carries meaning, but exclusion carries consequence. Different interpretations of internal discussions describe a growing awareness that this was not simply about inheritance, but about positioning, about where individuals stand within the long arc of royal continuity. Historical comparisons began to surface almost immediately. In previous generations, wills, though private, had followed pattern. Arends that reflected hierarchy, duty, and established roles. Even when sealed, their structure adhered to an unspoken logic that insiders understood instinctively. But this was different. This broke pattern. This disrupted expectation. And as those patterns were revisited, the contrast became impossible to ignore. Camilla's expected standing, shaped by her role and proximity to the throne, stood in quiet conflict with what the document actually revealed. That tension did not erupt outwardly, but it settled into the atmosphere, heavy, unresolved, and increasingly difficult to contain. Speculation, careful at first, began to deepen. Why would Queen Elizabeth II, known for her precision and long-term vision, allow such a gap to exist? Why construct a document so meticulously, only to leave out a name that seemed, by all outward appearances, inevitable? Those familiar with the Queen's approach to legacy began to consider a different possibility, that this was not an omission, but a message. A quiet directive embedded within legal language, designed not for immediate understanding, but for future interpretation. Insiders suggest that the more the document was examined, the clearer it became. The possibility became. Because there were no inconsistencies elsewhere, no loose ends, no ambiguity in other areas, which meant that this absence stood alone, intentional, isolated, and impossible to dismiss. And with that realization came a shift in perspective. This was no longer about questioning what had been overlooked. It was about confronting what had been decided. The emotional weight of that shift was subtle but undeniable. It reframed conversations. It altered assumptions. It forced those closest to the situation to reconsider not just the document itself, but the intentions behind it. And as that understanding took hold, one truth began to settle in with quiet force. This was not an oversight, it was a choice. A calculated, deliberate choice made long before the present moment, now unfolding with consequences that were only just beginning to be understood. But if Camilla's absence raised questions, Zara's sudden involvement raised even more. For years, Zara Tindall had remained outside the core power circle, respected, but never central. Until now. Because suddenly her name wasn't just present, it was pivotal. The shift did not happen loudly. It did not arrive with ceremony or announcement. It emerged quietly, almost cautiously, through the same channels that had first exposed the deeper tensions within the royal structure. Reports suggest that as the will of Queen Elizabeth II was examined more closely, Zara's name began to surface in places no one had previously considered. Not in passing references, not in symbolic mentions, but within key trust structures, those carefully constructed frameworks designed to control not just assets, but authority. And that changed everything. Because Zara had never positioned herself as a central figure within the monarchy's internal hierarchy. She had built a life adjacent to it, connected by blood, guided by tradition, yet deliberately distant from the mechanisms of power that often defined royal existence. That distance, once seen as a limitation, was now being reinterpreted as something else entirely. As neutrality, as trustworthiness, as a form of quiet reliability that had gone unnoticed until it became necessary. Insiders whisper that her connection to Princess Anne played a crucial role in this shift. Anne, long regarded as one of the monarchy's most disciplined and uncompromising figures, had always operated with a sense of duty that extended beyond appearances. Those familiar with her influence describe a guardian faction, a loose but powerful alignment of individuals committed to preserving the institution's integrity above all else. And within that framework, Zara's position began to make sense, not as an outsider, but as an extension of that philosophy. As someone shaped by it, even if she had never openly claimed it. Indications soon followed that Zara was not merely included, she was entrusted. With what, exactly, remains unclear. But the nature of the trust structures in which her name appeared suggests something more than ceremonial involvement. These are not passive roles. They are active, strategic, and often deeply consequential. To be placed within them is to be given responsibility not just for assets, but for decisions that ripple outward through the institution itself. And as this understanding began to take hold, the perception of Zara shifted almost overnight. No longer peripheral. No longer simply a respected member of the extended family, she became central. Essential. A figure whose presence within the unfolding narrative was not accidental but intentional. Early. Whispers of vindication began to circulate among royal observers, careful at first, but growing in confidence as more details emerged. Because for years, Zara's position had been defined by what she was not. Not a working royal, not a central decision-maker, not part of the inner circle. But now, those definitions were being rewritten. And in their place, a new narrative was forming, one that framed her not as overlooked, but as deliberately reserved for a moment that required exactly what she represented. Stability, discretion, alignment with a legacy that prioritized duty over visibility. And as that narrative gained momentum, one question began to surface with increasing urgency. If this was Zara's role now, what had it always been meant to be? The answer, still unfolding, carried implications that reached far beyond her alone. Because this was not just about elevation, it was about correction, about balance, about the quiet enforcement of a vision that had been set long before the present moment. And behind this sudden shift wasn't chance, it was the quiet movement of someone who had been preparing for this moment all along. While others reacted, Princess Anne moved, not with noise, but with precision. Because for those who understood the inner workings of the monarchy, this wasn't chaos. It was execution. For decades, Anne had carried a reputation that few dared to challenge, quietly relentless, unwavering in discipline, and deeply aligned with the institutional backbone of the crown. She was never the loudest voice in the room, but she was often the one whose decisions carried the most weight once the moment demanded clarity. Reports suggest that as the implications of Queen Elizabeth II's will began to crystallize, Anne did not hesitate. There was no period of uncertainty, no visible deliberation. Instead, there was movement, controlled, methodical, and unmistakably deliberate. Insiders whisper that within days of the document's deeper review, internal mechanisms were quietly activated. Not publicly, not ceremoniously, but through channels that operate beneath the surface of royal life, legal teams, administrative offices, and advisory networks that exist precisely for moments like this. Different interpretations of these early actions describe the triggering of internal audits, comprehensive reviews, designed not just to verify the authenticity of the will's provisions, but to align every existing structure with its intended outcome. This was not about questioning the document. It was about enforcing it. And enforcement in this context required more than acknowledgement. It required confirmation, validation, and in some cases, correction. Those familiar with the process began to refer to it in quiet terms as an iron protocol, a phrase that captured both its rigidity and its purpose. This was not a flexible response. It was a framework, long understood by those within the inner circle, activated only when the integrity of the institution demanded it. And once initiated, it did not pause. It advanced. Coordination with senior figures, including Prince William, reportedly followed swiftly. This was not a solitary effort. It was a convergence and alignment of those who recognized the gravity of the moment and the necessity of a unified response. William's involvement, while measured, added a layer of generational continuity to the process, reinforcing the idea that this was not merely about resolving a present tension, but about securing a future direction. At the center of it all remained Anne, steady, composed, and unwavering. Her action did not seek attention, but their impact was undeniable. Subtle adjustments began to appear within the structure, small at first, almost imperceptible, but increasingly difficult to ignore. Access points shifted. Responsibilities realigned. The invisible architecture of influence began to reshape itself in accordance with the will's underlying intent. And within that reshaping, one outcome became increasingly clear. Queen Camilla's position, while not publicly challenged, was being quietly redefined. Not through confrontation, but through omission. Not through announcement, but through absence. It was a weakening that did not require acknowledgement to be felt. Because in an institution where presence signifies power, even the slightest withdrawal carries meaning. Speculation grew, carefully at first, then with greater confidence, that what was unfolding was not a reaction but a restoration. A return to a structure envisioned long before the current moment, now being reinforced with deliberate care. And as each layer of that reinforcement took hold, the broader implications began to settle into place. This was not about individual standing. It was about institutional alignment. Ensuring that the legacy of the past was not diluted by the pressures of the present. And in that effort, Anne's role was not just significant, it was decisive. By the time the dust began to settle, the consequences were no longer theoretical, they were visible, structural, and irreversible. What followed wasn't an announcement. It was something far more telling: silence, distance, and a series of subtle exclusions that spoke louder than any official statement. In an institution where every gesture is measured and every appearance carries meaning, gestures are measured and appearances are measured. The absence of visible change often signals the presence of something far more deliberate unfolding beneath the surface. Reports suggest that within days of the internal confirmations surrounding Queen Elizabeth II's will, Patterns began to shift not dramatically, not in ways that would attract immediate public scrutiny, but in quiet, controlled adjustments that only those closest to the system could fully recognize. Invitations that once flowed without question became selective. Access points, previously taken for granted, were re-evaluated. Internal roles, those subtle positions that define influence more than title, began to realign. At the center of this recalibration stood a growing distance between Queen Camilla and the core decision-making circle. It was not a confrontation. There were no public disputes, no visible fractures. But the space between her and those shaping the monarchy's direction widened in ways that could not be ignored. Insiders whisper that conversations once shared are now filtered, that decisions once collaborative have become contained within a smaller, more tightly aligned group. Different interpretations of these changes describe a shift not in authority, but in proximity and within the royal structure. Proximity is everything. It defines not only who is heard, but who influences what is ultimately decided. As this quiet separation took hold, media narratives began to evolve. Carefully at first, framed in cautious language, but increasingly direct in their implications. Terms like power realignment started to surface, reflecting a broader recognition that something fundamental was changing within the institution. Not a crisis, not a collapse, but a recalibration, a deliberate repositioning of influence designed to reflect the deeper intentions embedded within the Queen's final direct. Ives. Public appearances, while outwardly composed, began to mirror this underlying tension. Observers noted subtle differences in positioning, in interaction, in the unspoken dynamics that reveal more than any statement ever could. Nothing overt, nothing confirmable, but enough to suggest that the internal atmosphere had shifted. And as that shift became more apparent, another development began to draw attention: Zara Tindall's increasing visibility within official contexts. Not through grand announcements or elevated titles, but through presence, through inclusion. Through a series of appearances and engagements that placed her closer to the institutional core than ever before. This was not coincidence. It was alignment. A reflection of the same forces that had brought her into the narrative in the first place, now expressing themselves through action rather than implication. The contrast was striking. On one side, a gradual distancing that spoke of reduced influence. On the other, a steady emergence that suggested growing trust. And between them, the quiet machinery of the monarchy continued to operate, precise, controlled, and guided by principles that rarely require explanation. Speculation, as always, followed. But beneath it all, a clearer picture began to form. This was not about individual conflict. It was about structure. About ensuring that every element within the institution aligned with a vision that had been carefully defined long before the present moment. And as that alignment took shape, the monarchy began to signal, in its own understated way, the emergence of a new internal order, one that did not announce itself, but simply existed, undeniable in its presence. But beneath the surface of these changes lay a deeper truth, one that spoke not just about power, but about legacy. In the end, this wasn't just about a will. It was about a final message, one left behind by Queen Elizabeth II, written not in words, but in decisions that would echo long after her reign. Because those who understood her approach to duty always knew that she did not operate in the moment, she operated across time. Every choice she made, every structure she approved, every document she sealed carried with it an awareness of consequences that extended far beyond her own lifetime. Reports suggest that what is now unfolding was never intended to surprise, it was intended to end. And endurance, in the context of the monarchy, requires more than stability. It demands foresight. It demands the willingness to place the institution above the individual, even when that choice carries personal cost. Those familiar with her decades of leadership describe a pattern that now feels unmistakable. She was not reactive. She was strategic. A quiet architect shaping the framework within which others would later operate, often without realizing the extent to which their paths had already been guided. That is why this moment feels less like disruption and more like revelation. Because what appears sudden is, in truth, the result of decisions made long ago, now reaching their intended point of impact. At the heart of those decisions was a principle she rarely needed to state aloud: duty over personal relationship. It was a principle that defined her reign, one that demanded restraint, discipline, and, at times, distance. And within the context of her final will, that principle appears to have been preserved with the same clarity that guided her public life. Interpretations of her choices suggest that they were not designed to punish or exclude, but to protect, to safeguard the continuity of the monarchy by ensuring that its core structures remained aligned with its founding purpose. This was not about favor, it was about function. About ensuring that those entrusted with influence would carry forward a vision rooted not in personal ambition, but in institutional responsibility. Insiders whisper that this is where the concept of Guardians of the Crown begins to take shape, not as a formal title, but as an understood role. A group, loosely defined yet unmistakably present, whose responsibility is not to lead for recognition, but to preserve for continuity. And within that framework, certain figures naturally align. Figures whose actions reflect not a desire for prominence, but a commitment to stability. It is within this context that Zara Tindall's evolving role begins to make sense. Not as an unexpected elevation, but as part of a long-term design. A placement that reflects trust, not visibility. Responsibility, not status. Because in a system built on legacy, the most important roles are often those that are least visible until the moment they are needed. And when that moment arrives, they do not emerge by chance, they step into positions that were I prepared long before. The emotional weight of that realization is difficult to ignore. It reframes everything that has come before. It transforms questions into answers, uncertainty into clarity. Because what once appeared as absence now reveals itself as intention. What once felt like omission now reads as instruction. And as that understanding settles, one truth becomes increasingly clear. This was never about the present moment alone. It was about shaping what comes next. About ensuring that the monarchy would continue not just as a symbol, but as a structure capable of withstanding the pressures that inevitably come with time. And in that effort, every decision, every placement, every exclusion carries meaning that extends far beyond individual circumstance. And as that vision became clearer, so did the message it carried, one that would define the monarchy's future. The monarchy did not erupt. It recalibrated. Quietly. Precisely. And in doing so, it revealed a truth that had always been there, just waiting for the right moment to surface. What had unfolded over days and weeks now began to settle into something more permanent, more defined. Reports suggest that within the inner structure of the royal family, the shift was no longer subtle, it was understood. Not publicly declared, not formally outlined, but unmistakably present in the way decisions were being made, in the way influence was being distributed, in the way silence itself had begun to carry authority. This was not a collapse of hierarchy. It was a refinement of it, a return to alignment. And within that alignment, a new balance of power emerged, shaped not by reaction, but by intention that had been set long before the current moment. At the center of that shift stood Zara Tindall, no longer positioned at the edges of the institution, but firmly within its evolving core. Her presence, once understated, now carried weight. Not because it demanded attention, but because it reflected trust, deep, deliberate trust rooted in continuity rather than ambition. Insiders whisper that her role has come to symbolize something far greater than personal recognition. It represents stability, a bridge between legacy and future. A quiet assurance that the values embedded within the monarchy will not be diluted as time moves forward. And in that symbolism, her rise is no longer surprising, it feels inevitable. The other side of this recalibration, Queen Camilla's position has been redefined, not through confrontation, but through correction. The shift has not been framed as loss, but as adjustment, a realignment that reflects the deeper priorities of the institution itself. Different interpretations suggest that this was never about diminishing an individual, but about reinforcing a structure that cannot afford imbalance. Because within the monarchy, influence must always serve continuity. And when that balance is disrupted, even subtly, the system responds not loudly, but decisively. Guiding that response were figures whose roles have now become unmistakably clear. Princess Anne, steady and unyielding, operating with the same discipline that has defined her entire life. And Prince William, carrying forward that discipline into the next generation. Together, they did not impose a new order, they revealed one that had already been set into motion. Their actions, measured yet firm, ensured that the transition from uncertainty to clarity was not disruptive, but seamless. And as that clarity spread, public perception began to shift alongside it. What once appeared as speculation started to feed. I like confirmation. Observers, analysts, and commentators began to frame the unfolding events in a single, resonant word: vindication. Not as a victory of one individual over another, but as the validation of a system that had quietly corrected itself. A system that had absorbed tension, processed it, and emerged more aligned with its foundational principles than before. Because at its core, the monarchy does not operate on impulse. It operates on legacy. On decisions that are measured not in moments, but in generations. And what this moment has ultimately reinforced is a principle that has guided it through centuries of change. Duty above all. Duty over preference. Duty over proximity. Duty over personal ambition. It is a principle that does not always reveal itself immediately, but when it does, it leaves little room for doubt. And now, as the final pieces fall into place, that principle stands clearer than ever, not spoken, not declared, but lived through every quiet decision that brought the monarchy to this point. Because in the end, the crown was never about who wanted it most, it was always about who was chosen to protect it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.